How are you doing, Chris?
I'm doing great. It was nice talking with you this morning and to see you. I guess it's the first time I've seen you since, I guess 10 months ago at the New Orleans conference. And
Yeah, that was a good time.
yeah, we had fun there and learned a little about conference now. Nice to have one to do tonight. And Jimmy, perhaps for anyone who maybe didn't see the film, you could give a recap of what's it about, what it's about, and just lay that out for everybody.
Yeah, of course. So I started a house painting business back in 2006. So like literally the month that house prices peaked, I kind of got into the industry, and I was only getting into the industry because I thought it would be a good way to make money to fund my projects. I dropped out of college to pursue film in 2006, and that was just kind of my way of money and flexibility to be able to go on the road and shoot projects. So a couple years later, I got into economics, and watching the housing crisis unfold, I didn't predict it or anything, but I kind of watched it as a house painter, and it just kind of gave me the idea that I should go out and find the people that predicted it. I did a torrent search for economics and stumbled across Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And so I had the idea that if he could write about this stuff back in the 40s, that there were people out there today that I could find that could give me the lesson so I didn't get wrapped up in the next bubble. So like I said, the first film is the housing bubble. We're splitting it up over 2 nights. But what people just watched was kind of the causes of the housing bubble. And then tomorrow night, we'll go over more history like the Great Depression and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's funny that you got into it through Austrian economics, which I think is what happens with a lot of people. And I don't know, I compare what you share in the film and Austrian economics. It reminds me of the Great Sports Almanac and Back to the Future Part 2, where when you understand what happens when you lower interest rates and why politicians never like raising interest rates and how the same thing has happened over and over again. I mean, it really points it out. It's just that usually anyone who talks about it, they tell you is a Fruit Loop. So most people just say nothing. But I mean, it really is incredible what you can layer once you understand that. You can pick up any chart of any stock market in any history and look at what's happening with the prevailing interest rate at that point in time, and all of a sudden it makes darn perfect sense, right?
Yeah, I think the cool thing about Austrian economics is it gives you like a much better understanding of how the world works than most people that study economics. But at the same time, it gives you the humility to know that like, hey, I can't predict exactly when things are going to crash or anything like that. But we can be smart enough to see that, some of these actions have consequences, and they can't just create trillions of dollars out of thin air. We can't just shut down the economy for a year and think that everything's just going to work out and the government can arbitrarily who's an essential worker and who's not. It's not feasible.
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, it's too bad Bernanke and the gang don't. Although, actually, Jimmy, I got a question for you. Maybe Yara, if you're out there, you can set up a poll. Are central bankers insanely incompetent, or are they just lying and stealing based on everything that you've seen and studied at this point, Jimmy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Ben Bernanke really believes in what he's doing, but I also think, well, not what he's doing anymore, but what he did. But I also think it was more like he was lying because he knew how impossible the situation was, and he just believed what he was going to do was going to prop everything up. And he thought, maybe it's not going to work down the road and it's going to screw everything up. But at this point, everything's so screwed. But I do think that, like, with what you see Alan Greenspan saying here in office and what we've seen Bernanke say, and probably what we'll see Jerome Powell say years from now, I think when they're in office, you can't believe a word they say. They're never going to tell you that they think stocks are in a bubble because they don't want to influence the market down. They want to just keep influencing it up as long as they can. So, I think regardless of whether their intentions were the purest possible, there's just nobody that can manage the economy this way. So.
Yeah, and I know you had Peter Schiff in the movie, and he has it was a couple of years ago. I'm sure he still mentions the same thing about how these guys talk about the economy like it's a car engine, it's overheating, underheating, and then they come along and they're like, well, inflation's 1.6%. So if we buy 2,343,612 and a third treasury bonds, we'll tweak it up, 613%, which is perhaps, what's the most ridiculous thing the Fed does? That's tough competition. But am I correct that it's kind of insane that these guys couldn't even spot the housing bubble while it was happening, and the idea that they're calibrating and tweaking? Is it insanity, Jimmy, or what do you think about that?
I think it's just arrogance, but they have all these employees, and like you said, none of these people were predicting the crash, and everybody was just encouraging it. And so it's something where throughout the last decade, especially, but even like for years before that, they have the hits that they say, but they never actually meet their targets. Like when they say we're gonna target interest rates of whatever percent, like most of the time they screw it up and are way off. So I think what we've seen in the past is, and Peter Schiff talks about this a lot, is that they kind of looked at wanting stable prices, but what they meant by stable prices was up to 2% price inflation, and then they were saying, okay, it's not enough. We gotta make sure we're at 2%, and now they're saying that 2%. And if we're under 2% for a while, then we need to go hot and go more than 2% to kind of balance it out.
Jimmy,
and so I think that's a dangerous policy shift right there, because things could really spiral out of control.
Dude, Jimmy, you gotta be careful over there, man. Look to your right. There's low inflation there. Be careful; it could come get you. You gotta watch out for that. The low inflation, it's everywhere. These guys, they talk about it the same way they talk about Corona, like these boogeymen that they create and then save us from. It's
like the M. Night Shyamalan movie, The Happening. Remember that? They're like running from the wind.
I didn't see The Happening. I saw Unbreakable with Bruce Willis. That was, I think,
that was a good one.
So from all this, you've met some interesting people, probably had a lot of interesting conversations. What's the most shocking thing that you came across during that entire time that people might be stunned to hear?
Oh, that's a good question. So I would say this is something we cover in the next movie, The Bigger Bubble. But at the time that everybody was arguing about the TARP bailout, which was like a bill that was like $700 billion. It got all the media coverage, and all this talk is about, oh, I can't believe they're bailing out banks, or, oh, we have to bail out the bank. And it was all about just $700 billion, which was, unspeakable at the time. Nobody thought that those numbers would have happened just a few years before. But at that same time, what we found out years later, thanks to Bloomberg, they actually sued to find this information out. But the Federal Reserve was secretly loaning a couple $1 trillion into the market, and they're going out and bragging that Morgan Stanley was able to survive, and that they gave them this TARP money, and look how they did, or whatever. But it was just a drop in the bucket compared to how much money they were getting from the Fed behind the table. So as far as what you're saying earlier about central banks just being like people who lie through their teeth, like, all throughout this story, it's just one lie after another. And I really loved catching Bernanke in the film, where he's talking about how they're not printing money and everything. And then we get him to acknowledge that, okay, it actually was printing money effectively. So it's kind of a funny moment in the film.
Do you ever wonder if Ben Bernanke, I've thought, like, is he lying or incompetent? I'm trying to be nasty, but I don't know what other word you can describe when the guy in charge of the world's reserve currency, which for the foundational years of the Federal Reserve and the last century was a measure of gold, until Nixon blaming it on speculators. We got to watch out for the speculators. And you always know where it's headed once it's time to pull out the blame it on the speculators card. But if Bernanke just has no idea about that, doesn't understand gold, None of his friends do either. It often reminded me of Reggie Jackson in The Naked Gun, where like the guy has the button and it becomes almost like a Manchurian candidate. Um, but it's like, what are people supposed to think? And it's like when when you talk about gold or silver, I mean, like what else are people supposed to think when they see that?
Well, I think gold and silver really over the last decade has been held back by the public's perception. But as a lot of people that are watching this know, we haven't faced that day of reckoning yet. And even though they've gotten away with creating all this money, they still distorted the economy. They still created a lot of problems. And banks and tech stocks and corporate debt, and you talk about all sorts of things on your show. There's all these issues that are going to have to come to play eventually. And with coronavirus, that's just kind of pushed that day of reckoning even closer. And even though we can't say exactly when it's going to happen, I think we realize that you can't just push interest rates down to nothing for a decade and think you're not going to radically transform the economy. And when you're basing an economy on spending instead of saving, that's just not going to work out. You're not going to be able to just grow an economy for 20 years by spending a bunch of money and not saving anything, which is what we've seen in the United States.
If anyone has questions about the movie, which was just playing on the stage, you can type that into the chat window. We have a lot of people chatting and logging on. Amen. Jimmy Morrison says Bruce Mannion. We got one from Matt, the Silver Ounce winner Marlowe, who says, how do you finance the system at 0%?
As far as like how exactly they finance everything, I mean, they're just creating money out of thin air. And as we've seen with 0% interest rates for the last decade, that's something that's really hurt savers. And a lot of retirees were not planning on not being able to get a return and not getting higher interest on a lot of their stuff the last decade. So as far as like the specific semantics, I'm not like, I'm not even an economist. I studied economics in college. I basically took all the economics you need to get a degree. I didn't finish my degree because you have to take a bunch of, you basically have to take like at the University of Iowa, a year and a half of non-business classes to get an economics degree. And so since I'm an entrepreneur, I just decided that I didn't necessarily need it. But I'm really more trying to be a filmmaker that's telling a story. And I think what we're able to do with these films is give people a story where they can sit down with their friends or their family, actually have somebody get at least the basics of what happened, where right now most people just have no idea about the Fed or no idea about why their prices are going up or why things are getting smaller in the grocery store or why the dollar is starting to go down. And so really we're trying to give people just a base knowledge, and then rather than give them all the answers, our hope is to have a decentralized response where we're going to learn from all the people that have watched the film and all the experts that you brought here to help us all make our decisions about what we think, how this all will play out and how to protect ourselves. Because really, like, the number one thing these days is uncertainty. And when the Fed has like created all these interventions, nobody knows exactly how this is all going to play out. Like, we're in completely unprecedented territory. And so it's not a situation where I was able to just go interview these people and then know, okay, this is exactly what you need to do. These are all the right investments. These are the companies you need to invest in. This is when you should short the market. You can't learn those things. All you can learn is, okay, there are these potential consequences, and we need to learn how to protect ourselves. And I think that's what's led a lot of us to gold and silver.
Yeah, I agree with that. And we have a couple of comments. Way to step out and make these films, Jimmy. Steve K mentions good work on the film. It's easily digestible and should be helpful for people in general. Again, we are here with film and documentary maker Jimmy Morrison, who made the film The Bubble. I have a question for you, Jimmy, although Beast Mode we read. Tim Ponting says, Jimmy, what do you see as the tipping point for the next crash?
That's a real good question. I think something that at more long term is more like the debt issues and the unfunded liabilities in the United States. And that was something that even the Congressional Budget Office was admitting the United States was going to be in big trouble in about a decade. And so with everything that's happened this year, where they've just massively propped everything up and just assume they're going to be able to get away with just creating trillions of dollars, buying debt from companies like Apple, and then Apple going out and buying their own stock to prop it up. It's just, we've really kind of hit a tipping point, I think. And so I think what we're going to see is maybe they're going to be able to keep propping things up and, you know, injecting stimulus here and there, and people are going to be able to make a little bit off of that. But I think what we're really going to see is we're going to have supply chain issues from all these shutdowns, and we're already starting to see that. And food prices are already going up, and especially with all the issues happening in Asia right now with the weather, them needing to import food. It's really kind of an interesting point to watch food prices in the United States, which is something the Fed doesn't do. You know, when they talk about inflation, they say, "Oh, except for food and energy prices," because they act like that's not something that affects everyday Americans.
Why would that be important? I mean, and Jimmy, are you able to share? You don't have to put details. Are you able to share anything about your part-time job? I think that would be fascinating for people. If you can't, I understand. If you can, you let me know.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have signed an NDA, so I have to be careful about how I explain this. I like to say that I'm a secret agent or like a double agent. What I do is I go into grocery stores and I scan prices, and then the company I work for has clients that are trying not to get in trouble, trying to find out that information because they may carry those items. And so it's really an interesting job. I just do it part-time. It allows me to listen to audiobooks and podcasts and stuff. And it's given me the flexibility where I can do things like take off for this movie and stuff like that. But really the reason I still do it, because I could just be doing video production all the time. But the reason I do it is because it's really like a hands on the ground, like a chance to get down and dirty with prices. And I've spent the last 5 years, you know, just spending a few hours or a little more than that, but some time in grocery stores each week. And it gives you a really interesting perspective. You know, you really see when items start to shrink. You know, you see like Raisin Bran and dish soap going, they're 10% smaller, 12% smaller, and it just has the price is the same, and maybe they'll be like, oh, that looks a little smaller, but they don't realize how substantial it is. But like I said, I think we're really starting to see prices go up a little bit, and it's concerning that the Fed is shifting to an even more reckless policy than we saw in 2008, because in 2008, at that time, that was unprecedented then. You know, nobody had ever bailed out foreign banks the way the Fed did. And now they're just, you know, going out and buying corporate bonds from individual companies and then having press conferences and saying, oh, by the way, we bought this debt off all these companies. Here's the list of their names. We're going to keep buying debt. We're going to buy a bunch of debt from all these companies and more companies. Just look at the list. And then if you're somebody in the market that doesn't happen to see that press conference, or you don't happen to see this, like, how are you supposed to invest in a market like that when the Fed is just coming out with press conferences announcing random lists of companies getting huge injections of money? Like, it's a really scary turning point in this country.
Yeah, so I guess when the 99-cent bag of Doritos goes to $1.49 and becomes smaller, it sounds like you calculate that as more than the 2%. Or no, even 2% yet. We have this inflation deficit that we have to make up for. So would you say it's accurate to say that that's a giant load of crap?
Yeah, I think anybody that shops can see that. And there's actually a great clip in the sequel of Ron Paul asking Ben Bernanke if he does his own grocery shopping. And Ben Bernanke's like, oh, yeah, of course I do, you know. And Ron Paul's, he's like, well, then you know this is completely ridiculous. Like, nobody believes these numbers. But they get for now. I don't think anybody that actually shops in grocery stores and is honest with themselves can say that prices are stable. But that's just me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess that's what they do. And so, after all that you've seen, Jimmy, where does that leave you on the silver market? What do you think's going on there, and what are you expecting?
Yeah, so I think that since our audience is probably a little more educated, the the thing I'd point to is that we didn't see a lot of the price inflation in the U.S. With this all the money that they created and bailed out the banks with this last time around. A lot of that inflation ended up in Asia, but a big part of that was because the Fed wanted the banks to have solvent balance sheets, right? And so they created all this money and gave it to them, but they knew it couldn't go into the economy because the amount would just completely wreck everything. And so they actually paid banks money not to lend it out. If they kept the money at the Federal Reserve, they pay interest on that, and then they'd go out and give speeches saying, "We just don't get why banks aren't lending when they have this guaranteed money right here." So it's just it's crazy. But so that is something where a lot of price inflation that people thought was going to happen hasn't happened yet. But this time around with the coronavirus, they're just creating all this money and giving it to people and loaning it to businesses directly. And so I really think we're at a point with all the supply chain issues and with all the money that's coming into the economy and with everybody kind of reassessing things. And although the dollar has been the safe haven, we're seeing it being used as a world reserve currency less and less year after year, decade after decade. And it's got to be getting to a turning point. And that's the really scary thing is when all this money starts coming back to the US and, we don't have the production or the savings to deal with it because it's all just been printed money for a couple decades.
Yeah, and what would you say to people that perhaps are a little bit new to this and have heard safe flight to safety is the dollar, the treasury? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess kind of to elaborate more on the silver position, we saw gold reach its all-time high already compared to how people thought it was going to go after this last crash, which was kind of what I was getting to with why the price inflation didn't come. But we've seen gold already get back to its all-time high. But I think what a lot of people notice right away with silver is that it's nowhere near its all-time high. So I think it's a similar way of hedging, and gold and silver, they kind of tend. Silver's a little more wild. Gold and silver kind of tend to go with people's confidence in the ability of central banks to kind of make this all work. If everybody thinks that Ben Bernanke saved the economy, that's going to make things go longer than they would have otherwise. But just with all these supply chain issues and everything, and with all the wasted resources in the United States the last 20 years, we had these crashes and we didn't react to them. We didn't readjust and get on a sound basis to grow out of. We're just propping up all these banks and all these companies, and then they just get more and more debt at these low interest rates. And so we've just made all these zombie companies and zombie banks that the economy is going to have to deal with. So, even though people have used treasuries and the dollar as a safe haven, I think it's just really risky going forward.
Yeah, I mean, unless you really want to lock in that negative yield best case scenario.
Yeah,
Jim,
exactly.
what would you say to someone like Peter Arnold who says we need a silver movie, or to this guy Chris from Minnesota, let's say, who came up with this plot called The Big Silver Short? Are you going to help us turn this into a movie one day?
Well, right now I'm really focused on finishing the sequel, The Bigger Bubble. This project has been, we started shooting May 2011, so it's been a long journey. I never expected it to take this long. But I'm not going to rule out collaborating on some sort of silver project. I'd love to work with you, Chris, and I really support all the work you guys are doing here. And I'm really excited about the festival. I think everybody's going to have a great time this weekend, and we're all going to learn a lot. So it's going to be a good time. But yeah, I think documentary is a very effective medium for getting these ideas out there. So I won't rule it out.
Well, that's exciting to hear. And perhaps can you tell us a little bit about the upcoming movie?
Yeah, so it starts. So tomorrow night we'll watch the second half of this first film, and then the sequel, The Bigger Bubble, starts with the bailouts in 2008 and kind of brings it up to today, or at least the beginning of when coronavirus hit and things start to crash. So some of the stuff we've talked about, like the secret Fed loans and the bailouts and everything, are in there. It's more of a current events film. You know, the first film right now, you guys just saw the causes of the housing bubble, but the second half of the first film goes more into the history, like I said. And so the second film gets to serve as more of a current events film, which is easier to keep people's attention. And I'll be able to reach more people that way. So I think people can watch the films in either order. So if they watch the second one, they'll be able to go back to the first and learn things. But they have to. We try to get all the core ideas accessible in each film. But one thing I'm excited about with it is this first film. I think it is very the people on the right are more receptive to it because it takes it from a free market angle and makes that approach of why the government shouldn't be manipulating prices or using relations to shift resources into one part of the economy. But what the second film does is, like I said, it starts with the bailouts and the stimulus. And so I think we're going to be able to reach a lot of people on the left because they're going to watch the second film and they'll start with all those bailouts and they'll kind of start cheering us on and get on our side a little bit. And then we'll be able to.
Ben Pendergast says, after all of your research, what's your biggest fear?
I guess my biggest fear is kind of happening. Like I said, we started shooting interviews in May 2011. And so when we shot these interviews, we were really looking at the economy and were back then. And even though, a lot of people debt the bailouts, whereas now, like, it definitely seems like the radically toward democratic socialism and the support of Medicare for all, and has really skyrocketed. Look at financial crisis in the United States and blame the free market. Movies like Inside Job and just the way things are portrayed in the news. But unfortunately, a lot of people just have that simple explanation of, we just needed to regulate more. And hopefully we can get this film out there to kind of counteract that. But I guess that's my biggest fear is just the shift toward democratic socialism and the consequences we're going to have from that. And it seems kind of inevitable at this point. I certainly don't see a Ron Paul movement, but hopefully that will change.
Yeah, although Jimmy, would I be correct then? I guess that means that the low inflation is not your biggest fear, that I know the Fed is quite concerned about.
At this point.
Okay, well, Kirian is saying, by the way, Kirian Van Pest, who many people have heard of recently, had a very interesting sequence of interviews on the Comex, is in the chat room there. And Kirian, yes, I am saying let's submit more bandwidth to the Fed's discount window. So, unfortunately, missed the film. Where can we watch it late, says Peter Arnold. Jimmy, where can people see the film?
So if people go to thebubblefilms.com, they can get it using the code SILVERFEST. They'll get 10% off, and you can send it to prisons, schools, libraries, Indian reservations. You can send it to your friends or family, or just get it yourself. But it's $10, so 10% off. It's $9.
Jimmy, I have, we'll try one or two more questions, and then we'll let you run. I appreciate you making some time on the Friday night. Someone asked, what's your opinion of the precious metals manipulation? And someone also asked your feelings on silver. Do you buy silver? If you feel or care to share the answer to
that. Yeah, so over the last decade, everything I've had in documentaries, because just record another, and you're going to have financial crises. Investing in documentaries about financial crises is a good way to hedge yourself against that. But I did buy gold and silver back in 2014. I think it was about $12.60 for gold, and I don't know what silver was, to be honest. bought it again at $22 earlier this year, and bought some more gold as well.